The Voyage of the Damned. The Voyage of the Damned. The prologue. On January 30th, 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt celebrated his 51st birthday. In little more than a month, he would be President of the United States. That same day, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. In a little less than 2 months, the Reichstag would make him absolute master of his country. On taking office, the two men faced similar problems, but they chose opposite paths to a solution. Their policies would force them inexorably onto a collision course. In Germany, the Fuhrer took over a country suffering from self-doubt and in the grip of an economic collapse so serious it seemed insoluble. His solution was to make the Jews scapegoat for all the nation's ills. Get rid of them, he maintained, and the patient would recover. Hitler never wavered from this prescription, never concealed it, and by May 1939, thousands had fled. Thousands were in hiding, thousands in concentration camps. Though the gas ovens were not yet in operation, many people died daily. Many people died daily of malnutrition and maltreatment. And what was happening in Dachau and Buchenwald was already known to the governments of the major powers. In America in 1933, Roosevelt had also been confronted by a critical situation. The worst economic crisis in history left banking in chaos. There were some 12 million unemployed. The nation was suffering from an acute loss of self-confidence. In 1935, America's isolationism was strengthened. With the passing of the Neutrality Act, the United States was not yet willing to take sides. The Jews in Germany, there were some 500,000 of them when Hitler took power, were of two minds. Some viewed Adolf Hitler as a temporary aberration, and they waited, alas, in vain for things to change. Other Jews sought to escape. They illegally crossed the borders of Switzerland, Holland, Belgium, and France. They sometimes intentionally broke laws in order to be put into prison. A safer course than being returned to Germany. A small percentage made it to America or England. But for most of those trapped in the German concentration camps or those about to be put to death, escape could come only if they could convince the Nazis that they could book passage on a ship that would take them away from the fatherland. There were a few ships available and precious few countries willing to accept them as passengers. In 1939, Britain, faced with an Arab revolt in the Middle East, was about to drastically curtail the number of immigrants it would allow into Palestine at home. There were 25,000 refugees. Britain may have been more charitable than many other nations, but His Majesty's government was preparing for an all-out war, and there was no great enthusiasm for accepting more refugees from the country. Britain was about to fight France, overflowing with some 250,000 refugees, many from Spain's civil war. Stated that it had reached the saturation point. A trickle of German refugees was allowed into certain South American, African, and Commonwealth countries, but not nearly as many as needed a haven. Shanghai was the end of the road. 15,000 found refuge there in 2 years, but even Shanghai's open door was soon to be shut when the Japanese occupied the port. President Roosevelt Franklin Delano appealed to the world for a suitable area to which refugees could be admitted in almost unlimited numbers. Hitler suggested Madagascar. Roosevelt wrote to Rome about Ethiopia. Mussolini replied in favor of the open areas of Russia. The Soviet Union considered Alaska appropriate. America suggested Angola. Portugal thought other places in Africa had more to commend them. The United States then favored the Central African highlands for the German Jews, most of whom were middle-class professionals, shopkeepers, and businessmen now softened by centuries of European civilization. The Orinoco River Valley in Venezuela, Mexico, the plateaus of southwestern Africa, Tanganyika, Kenya, northern Rhodesia, Nyaziland. The entire confusing collection of suggested sites was discussed, investigated, and dismissed either by Jewish organizations or by national governments. Understandably, most of the refugees wanted to go to the legendary land of opportunity. America. Throughout the 30s, America struck rigidly to its old immigration laws. Her early settlers were mainly British, Irish, and other Northern European whites. When the quota system was introduced, it had the effect of maintaining America's status quo. The number of immigrants allowed in from any one country depended on the proportion of settlers who were already in America from that country around the turn of the century. Thus, a system originally introduced to stop the wholesale entry of undesirables of the 19th century was, by 1939, acting as a deterrent in a quite different situation. The United States was prepared to accept about 26,000 immigrants from Germany per year. In normal times, that's a relatively large number, but in the critical situation of German Jews, all too few. In any case, since the Jews in Germany were hardly treated as ordinary Germans, the question remained: of the 26,000 Germans allowed into America per year, how many should be German Jews? The answer often depended on the personal inclinations of American consular officials in Germany. Any applicants likely to become a public charge were refused. The 10 Reichsmarks, about $4, Germany allowed refugees to take with them was insufficient, according to many consular officials. Nor did the officials always understand it was not possible for the refugees to acquire from the Nazi government the character references required for admission to the United States. Eleanor Roosevelt, wife of the president, was sympathetic to the plight of the refugees. She favored every move in support of refugee aid, but her husband, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was a politician who knew it was hazardous to ignore public opinion. The majority of the American electorate then as now wished not to be involved in the affairs of others. A large part of the populace, middle America, the blue-collar class, was openly anti-Semitic. Many were themselves earlier immigrants from Central and Eastern European countries where anti-Semitism was endemic. In America, they were further influenced by men like Father Charles E. Coughlin, the Detroit priest who used his Sunday afternoon radio broadcast to preach Nazi principles to an audience of 15 million. In Yorkville, American heart of Nazism, the Fuhrer of the German-American Bund, Fritz Kuhn, found especially receptive audiences for his views. Large crowds thronged to Madison Square Garden for Nazi rallies. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's cabinet was not generally composed of men inclined to confront the issue. Some senior members, such as Secretary of State Cordell Hull, seem to have been chosen more for their usefulness as a bridge between the president and the conservative senators than for their energy or diplomatic and intellectual abilities. And most congressmen were rigidly isolationists. In 1939, with an election pending, and opinion polls showed that 83% of the electorate was against increasing the number of refugees allowed into the country. The message was clear: any president would change the American immigration laws, would do so at his peril. Refugees from Germany who wished to enter the United States, if they were able to satisfy all the requirements, were put on the quota. This gave them a place on the increasingly long waiting list. When their number came up in the queue, they would be allowed in. In 1939, many on the quota were told the waiting time for them would be years. They knew they would not survive the delay. So instead, they found somewhere outside of Germany where they could wait safely until their numbers came up, and then they could enter America. There were a few friendly countries who offered this essential temporary refuge. Cuba was the only country close to the United States willing to accept refugees in large numbers for a price. But the question was which Cuban politicians would get the money. By early May 1939, the cast for the drama was beginning to assemble. They were 937 men, women, and children. Some had been on the run, some in concentration camps, some had been waiting to be imprisoned. All were seeking an opportunity to escape. The decision that they would be allowed to leave Germany was approved during a working luncheon in a private dining room of the Hotel Adlon in Berlin in April 1939. For the Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring, the decision was a practical, temporary solution. He accepted the Fuhrer's directive that there must be a final solution to the Jewish problem, but until it could be implemented, Hermann Göring was in favor of letting the Jews go. Naturally, the Reich would extract as high a price as possible, confiscation of all goods and property, except personal clothing, or the imposition of prohibitively high taxes payable, preferably in the foreign currency, needed to boost Germany's faltering economy and to purchase raw materials for a war to come. What most interested the Nazis was the use that could be made of the ship and its passengers once it left Germany. Dr. Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, spoke openly at the luncheon. The voyage could be exploited to the full for propaganda purposes. The German nation could be told that it was part of the general house cleaning operation. The world at large could be told that here was clear evidence that Germany was allowing Jews to leave unharmed and unimpeded. The host, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, held a head of German military intelligence. The Abwehr laid his plans quietly. By the time he returned to his second floor office at 7276 Tirpitz Ufer, he had begun to work out a scheme. The ship would be used for an important espionage mission, and so it was that in May 1939 the SS St. Louis sailed into a sea of uncertainty, one of the last ships to leave Nazi Germany before Europe was engulfed in war. Madison Square Gardens, Yorkville, the SS St. Louis, I thought it was the DS or something, the 937 Jewish people, the last ship of not just of everybody, but last ship of not just the Jewish folks, but of anybody to leave Nazi Germany. And then maybe it could have been a spying mission. Number 1, A Chance to Live, Wednesday, May 3rd, 1939. The captain of the Hamburg American Line passenger ship St. Louis did not look forward to the meeting that cool Wednesday morning of May 3rd, 1939. For the first time in his 37 years at sea, Gustav Schroeder was uncertain and uneasy about a voyage. The newly pressed blue serge trousers and high-buttoning jacket were for him a reminder that his meeting with line director Klaus Gottfried Holthusen was to be an important one. Usually Schroeder slipped into his favorite gray suit to go ashore for his end-of-voyage report to the Marine Superintendent in Hapag House, a few blocks away from Shed 76, where the St. Louis was now tied up on the Hamburg waterfront. But this morning, when the liner berthed after another voyage from New York, Schroeder had been ordered to report personally to Holthusen. After he dressed slowly and carefully, Schroeder once more opened the wall safe in his day cabin to read the cable again to seek a clue in its content. The message had come during dinner some 800 miles out of New York. When his steward discreetly handed him the radiogram, it gave him an excuse to leave the tedious table talk about Hitler and Nazi dreams of expansion in the half-empty first-class dining room. The absence of passengers, a liner was less than a third full, was depressing evidence of the deepening world crisis. The majority on board were Germans returning from the United States. Some of them wore party badges and were pleased to see that many of the crew also displays the Nazi emblem on their uniforms. The fact that the captain did not cause much comment, but no one dared raise the matter with him. He was reputed to be precise, studious, and correct in all details. To his deck officers, he seemed to be of the courtly 19th century, not of the 20th, but when Schroeder was roused by something that displeased him, his language was so forceful and salty that it stunned those he addressed. He was also said to be the smallest officer in the German merchant navy. In the graph on the bridge, Captain Schroeder was only 5 feet 4 inches tall, but although he was small, it seemed immaterial. His body had hardly an ounce of surplus fat. He practiced calisthenics for 20 minutes each day without fail. The only wrinkles on his face were tiny crow's feet fencing his clear blue eyes. He had the look of a man who had measured distant horizons all his life. His hair was gray, clipped short at the temples. He had it trimmed once a week by his steward. His skin was tanned from almost a lifetime at sea. Gustav Schroeder looked what he was, an energetic, experienced, and capable captain. After the cable came, Schroeder had deciphered the apparently meaningless numbers. The code had been introduced by the line to communicate confidential information to its captain.